Was the Trevor Lawrence extension worth it for the Jacksonville Jaguars? We talk about that and so much more coming up next during this episode of Locked On NFL.
You are Locked On NFL, your daily NFL podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On NFL, your daily NFL podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Ostraker. I am the host of Locked On Ravens and one of the many NFL experts here on our network, the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being here today, making Locked On NFL your first listen each and every day. We're free and available on all podcasting platforms. That includes in video form on YouTube and in audio form wherever you get your shows for 5 days a week of daily NFL coverage. Today's episode of Locked On NFL is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. On today's show, we're going to be talking about Trevor Lawrence. If that extension was worth it for the Jaguars, we'll get into that with Tony Wiggins of Locked On Jaguars. Then Mike Tomlin extended a 3-year extension. Chris Carter of Locked On Steelers will join us for that. And then finally, Alvin Kamara is their drama in New Orleans. Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints will be with us for that. So any further ado, let's first get into our conversation with Tony Wiggins of Locked On Jaguars. The Jacksonville Jaguars are the latest team to sign their quarterback to a big money extension, and Trevor Lawrence here to talk about that with me is Tony Wiggins, the host over at Locked On Jaguars. And Wig, I think for people, this quarterback market is absolutely crazy. It's just one guy, one-upping after another. Trevor gets 5 years, $275 million, $200 guaranteed with $142 at signing. A lot of big numbers there, but was this expected for you, the timing of it and the deal that he ended up getting?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was his turn, I guess. It's his time, and that's the way the quarterback market works. I think people need to get used to the fact that if you're a top 15 guy, this is what's going to happen. You know, you're going to get an extension, you're going to get money. And if you're well thought of in that individual organization as a leader and as a person who can really lead, galvanize a team and be the catalyst for a team to elevate, if you act that way, you're going to get that money even more, and people aren't going to understand it. And that's what happened in this situation.
And for Trevor, I know that with these big money contracts come other expectations, and this Jaguars team certainly does, especially in that AFC South, which I think is going to be ultra competitive this year. What does this do for your expectations, Wig, in terms of him and Trevor and what this Jaguars team needs to do with a big money quarterback now on the roster?
So even if you, and I don't feel this way, but I'm going to give you this example. Even if you're the guy that says he's not worth the money, it was definitely worth it for Doug Peterson and Trent Baalke. If Trevor doesn't work out in the next 2 years, they're going to get fired anyway, right? If it doesn't pan out, they're going to get fired. If he does work out, doing the extension now makes sense because $53 million will turn into $63 if he does the Joe Flacco and he gambles on himself and he plays well. But if it doesn't work, when the extension really kicks in 2026, they'll be gone. And that contract will be somebody else's problem to deal with Trevor Lawrence, not theirs. So even if you're that guy, if you're the pessimist type, you got to look at it and realize that it makes sense for them to not allow him to gamble on himself and throw for 30 touchdowns next year and 4,800 yards. And then he comes to the door with a price tag of $63 million. It just makes sense. And there are a lot of people that don't understand that. They're compounding issues. They're saying whether or not they don't believe he's worth it, that's one thing. But then they're really leaking over into another area where you don't understand that it doesn't matter whether you think he's worth it or not. It's like buying a house in a neighborhood. You might not like it, but all the houses have a certain value. So therefore, when you move into that neighborhood, you got to pay a tax. And that's what it is. When you want a quarterback moving into the future, you're going to pay for it. It might not be the results from the past. Don't dictate that. It's what you expect him to do in the future.
Yeah, and it's what the market is. I mean, you mentioned it, Wig. If you have a top 15 guy and they say, hey, I want to be the highest paid quarterback in the league or I'm walking, you're going to tell them no and restart? I mean, especially when you're a competitive team like Jacksonville is expected to be, you know, you kind of have to at that point. And with Trevor, it's not like he's a bad player. He's a good quarterback. But It's just like the way the quarterback market is, every guy's going to one-up the other guy. But how does this maybe change, Wig, what Jacksonville does with their roster, right? You have big money quarterback contract, again, doesn't kick in until next season, well, 2020, whenever that kicks in. 2026, is that when it kicks in?
Yeah.
Okay, so in 2026, what is that going to do to Jacksonville's roster construction? Are they maybe set up to get a lot of other big money guys in, or are they going to have to maybe make some tough decisions with this roster?
That's a good question. See, you don't have this problem because in Baltimore, y'all have had a quarterback. and in Baltimore, even when they didn't have a quarterback, they focused on team building. So it was just like, well, we'll just build this thing up like a bird's nest. So when we do get a quarterback, he'll just land in this beautiful situation. The Jaguars don't have 2 Super Bowls in the last 25 years like the Ravens. So it's a whole different ballgame. The Jaguars always seemed like the type of team they were looking for hope, and they were looking for a reason, and they were looking for it, and now they got it. And that's what people who don't cover this team locally, that's why I love Locked On as a network, because you have local experts that can convey the feelings of the fans, and you understand what's going on because we have a finger on the pulse of the team. This team needed Trevor Lawrence to be committed, and now the excuses will go out of the window because Trent Baalke and crew, all you got to do, you've made the commitment. Whether people believe Trevor is the real deal or not, you have made a commitment that he is the real deal. So there's no excuse to not insulate him with better players, a better system, the most elite coaches you can find, and you got to get what you can out of this next 5 or 6 years, because if you don't, it's a problem.
Now, what do you want to see out of Trevor right now, Wig? Is it something where there are areas you want to see improvements on? And now that this quarterback contract has happened, essentially he has to get better at those areas. Where are Trevor's strengths and weaknesses right now?
Ball protection, and he's led, since he's been in the league, he leads the league in turnovers. There's a combination of fumbles as well as early on it was poor decisions in the red zone, but then it became a fumble issue. And I think he's just playing hero ball. He's trying too hard. That is on the Jaguars to make sure that he understands you do not have to be Patrick Mahomes. You do not have to be Josh Allen. Ain't nothing wrong with being Peyton Manning. Ain't nothing wrong with being Tom Brady. Ain't nothing wrong with being Drew Brees. Just sit back there. You don't have to be the golden child, man. Just sit back there and make the plays when the plays are there to be made. And sometimes it's a simplification of things. On 3rd and 4, don't throw the ball 17 yards down the field when you got a wide receiver or a running back sitting in the flat that can get you a first down. You don't have to be spectacular. All you have to do is be consistent. And that's the thing. People expect him to live up to this Hollywood thing, the long flowing hair and sunshine and all of that stuff, right? Don't worry about that. All you have to do is just play efficient football. If they're more efficient last year, they make the playoffs for 2 years in a row. And nobody is talking about this contract the way that they're talking about it. They're saying this is the first time in history the Jaguars have made the playoffs 2 years in a row, at least in modern day in the last 20 years. And everyone is saying, I get it and I understand. And that's one game. That's one game. If they win in week 18 against the Titans, they make the playoffs and win the division 2 years in a row. And I think that shuts people up. Just the consistency, man, and making sure you take the easy plays and not try to be hero and take the hard ones.
Yeah, now outside of this deal, Wig, Jacksonville's made a bunch of other additions to their roster this offseason. Obviously, the draft is come and gone as well. How confident do you feel in their roster as it stands at this moment?
I think they're better. I think they're more explosive. I definitely believe that where they were weak, they actually went out and addressed those things. But is it enough? Because everybody gets good. And I believe they were a better team last year than they were the year before, and they didn't go as far. So it's about timing. It's about winning certain games, certain key games that you have to win. The Jaguars started out 8-3 last year, man, and they didn't make the playoffs. The year before, they started out 2-7, and they did. It's about decreasing that variance between good and bad. And what has to happen is you can't have this big old window and this big old picture of extremism, like you're over here and you're over there. You got to close that thing down a little bit. Look, I'm talking to a guy who covers the Ravens for a living, and you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that. You have to get to the point where you know who you are every single week, and it's like a computer program, and you're not out there trying to find an identity. You know what your identity is, and it is on full display every single Sunday. That's what they have to do.
Tony's awesome, and for more on Tony, check him out right here on the Locked On NFL podcast, and of course over at Locked On Jaguars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Come up with a second segment here of Locked On NFL. Mike Tomlin extended why that was the right decision for Pittsburgh with Chris Carter of Locked On Steelers. Stay tuned, plenty to talk about on Locked On NFL. First, the show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Summertime means baseball, the NBA Finals, and more, and you can bet it all over on FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 you can use to bet everything from the Finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park. NBA Finals 3-1 between the Celtics and Mavericks. The Mavericks getting the game back on Boston in Game 4, traveling back to the Garden in Game 5. So we're going to see if the Celtics can close it out if you want to bet that over on FanDuel. Whether it be Finals MVP, if the Celtics win, is it Jaylen Brown, is it Jason Tatum? You can do that over on FanDuel. The Orioles, Gunnar Henderson making his MVP bid. You can bet on that over there as well. Plus for the Ravens, they open up the season against the Chiefs. The Ravens on FanDuel opened up at 2.5-point underdogs. If you like that money line, maybe you go over there, bet on FanDuel. Highly recommend doing that. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Add a big one to your summer bucket list. FanDuel, America's number one sportsbook. We're back. Our second segment, Locked On NFL. Kevin Oestreicher still here with you on this Monday edition episode. Really appreciate everybody being here today, making Locked On NFL a part of your day. Be sure to subscribe and follow along for 5 days a week of daily NFL coverage and content. Mike Tomlin got extended by the Pittsburgh Steelers, and Chris Carter of Locked On Steelers will be joining us to talk about why it was worth it for the Steelers to make the move. So we'll talk about that now. The Pittsburgh Steelers signed Mike Tomlin to a 3-year extension, keeping him in Pittsburgh beyond the 2027 season. I am Kevin Oestreicher. With me is Chris Carter, the host of Locked On Steelers. And Chris, I know in Pittsburgh, Mike Tomlin is a very storied coach. A lot of time in Pittsburgh and a lot of success there with the organization. Now, for you, what does this extension mean for Tomlin, mean for the Steelers? And was this something you were expecting now, or did you think this decision was going to be made maybe right before the season or maybe even during the season or next offseason?
I didn't necessarily expect it the very moment that it happened, but I expected it to happen this offseason. The Steelers don't go into the final year of a coach's career contract without extending it unless they were planning on not extending it.
Right.
And Mike Tomlin, it was so funny, but like anyone who was in the know said this man's going to get an extension after what he's been able to do the last couple seasons. And there were some people in Pittsburgh, they haven't extended him yet. He might be gone, because there's that small minority of Steelers fans that are just very loud, that don't like him, and they blame him for everything under the sun. And I kept telling people, like, it's going to happen. Stop fretting about it. And even people that do like Mike Tomlin, they're like, well, why hasn't it happened yet? I'm like, because it's a formality at this point. Like, it's going to be like Mike Tomlin's going to get a raise. He's going to get something, and they just need to figure out what it is. But you know what? They know that Mike Tomlin and the Steelers are going to come to the table and work, whereas they had to do the draft process, do their scouting, prepare for the draft, do free agency, sign who they needed to do there, assess what they needed out after OTAs, and see they went and got Cameron Sutton. And it was after that they were like, okay, now let's see what needs to happen here. And so they got it done, and he's going to be a Steeler through the 2027 season unless he retires. And personally, I think it's a good move for the Steelers. I think it gives them a guy who has guided them through some really tough times after the Ben Roethlisberger era. They have not fallen off a cliff like many expected them to do so. In fact, in the last 4 straight seasons, they've had winning records. Even with struggling quarterback play, and 3 out of those 4 seasons they've made the playoffs. So I think that there's a lot to be said about what Mike Tomlin's been able to do over the past few years. The defense he's been able to establish with this nucleus that he's built, and also the younger players that are coming into the organization, and the culture reset that he's doing with this team. So I think he's done a lot of things right. The Steelers acknowledge that, and they're saying, hey, you know what? We recognize things haven't been, amazing for the past few years, because the Steelers haven't won a playoff game since the 2016-2017 season. But they also recognize that, like, a lot of those teams weren't supposed to get to the playoffs, and somehow they got there. And Mike Tomlin had a big reason for that.
Right. Tomlin being, I think, the beacon of consistency there in Pittsburgh over the course of his tenure. Can you kind of dive a little more, Chris, into the culture that he has set there since he's come in and been the Steelers head coach? Because he's somebody who I think a lot of people know him as a player's coach, a fiery guy, someone who doesn't take any garbage, but he's able to speak his mind. And he's someone that I think the players love over there. So what has he been able to do over his time in Pittsburgh, and what are you hoping he can continue to do as this extension goes?
He challenges his team a lot in different ways, but he isn't an overbearing coach. Like in many ways, like Bill Belichick was known for, overstepping his boundaries, being involved in every little thing. Mike Tomlin believes in, people having their autonomy in the organization. Like he lets coaches coach players, but whenever he'll boss walk, he'll come around, he'll see everybody during practice. It's not like he's not involved, but he's more so like the captain of the ship, and he trusts his lieutenants to handle their business, as well as the team captains to handle their business. And then when he sees a point where he needs to step in, he steps in. We believe he stepped in with George Pickens when George Pickens wasn't acting right towards the end of the season, and then all of a sudden George Pickens has a phenomenal final 3 weeks of his season after Mike Tomlin talks to him. So Mike Tomlin is a guy who I think everyone, like, the other thing is that like you go around the league, all the players he's coached, all the coaches who have coached under him, there's not some buildup of people who have this disdain for him or think that he's overrated that have worked in the NFL. There are some people that think that in the local Pittsburgh media. I'm not one of those people, and those people don't. I don't think that most of those people aren't in the Steelers locker room or around the Steelers locker room most times out of the year. So I think that Mike Tomlin, he commands respect, but he also respects others. He's also the kind of guy, like, he doesn't believe in babying you. Like, whenever the Steelers, and I think this is also kind of what's remarkable about how these young Steelers teams have been able to fight through moments. He doesn't. If you don't do your job, he's going to find someone else who does. And he doesn't come up and coddle you and do these different things. He's like, hey, I have this line you need to meet. If you don't meet it, we're going to go get somebody else. And and if you don't want to be mature enough, we'll go get somebody else, or we'll do this a different way. And it's just kind of it is what it is. And players know, basically, when they tell him something, they know that's the line they have to meet. And that's what a lot of players find refreshing, is that they'll go into camps or teams, and they'll be told things that might not be true, and they'll feel like the rug was pulled out from underneath them, and that very rarely happens with Tomlin as head coach of the Steelers. And I think a lot of players appreciate that, even the ones that don't work out in Pittsburgh.
Right. And I think with this extension now, it gives the organization just stability. I think it takes, that stressor off of what's the future of Coach Tomlin and everything that goes on there. But what do you want to see from him in terms of team success, player success? Is there a timeline for this in terms of Pittsburgh making the playoffs and continuing to do that, winning the Super Bowl? Like, what is the timeline, and what do you want to see out of the Mike Tomlin Pittsburgh Steelers over these next 3+ years?
I think this is a year where the offensive line's identity needs to become more solidified. Toward the second half of last season, with Broderick Jones becoming a starter, you saw the Steelers, the only team that ran for more yards per game than the Steelers in the last 10 games of the season was the Baltimore Ravens. And a lot of that had to do with the offensive line improving, the offense finding an identity, and them starting to figure that out. But the thing was that when we asked what the Steelers' offensive identity was to the players themselves by like week 11, week 12 last year, they were like, we're still figuring that out. This year, there is no question. Arthur Smith has this offense. Hey, we're going to be physical. We're going to dominate. We're going to bully people at the line of scrimmage, and then we're going to build our offense off of that point. And I think that's going to help the Steelers. I don't know if the Steelers will win a playoff game this year, but I think this is the year where that identity is found, and it sets up the opportunity to be a Super Bowl contender. If the offense works and the quarterback play is solid from either Russell Wilson or Justin Fields, that Russell Wilson's probably going to be the starter to at least start the season. But if they get solid quarterback play with good offensive line play, with good run game, and the defense stays healthy, I think this team can be a serious contender in the AFC. And I think by next year, if they get that for a year and that carries over, then you see the Steelers back in the Super Bowl conversation. But they need the offensive nucleus to gel. They need the defense to stay healthy. And if they do those few things with the pieces that they've added, I think the Steelers could be a real problem.
Chris is amazing with the Steelers insight, and for more on Chris, check him out over the Locked On Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Plus, Chris is right here over at Locked On NFL as well. Coming up with the final part of the show, Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints will be joining us for Alvin Kamara potential drama. We'll talk about that next, coming up on Locked On NFL. We're back on final segment of Locked On NFL. Kevin Oestreicher still rocking out with you here on this Monday, another week of NFL content over here on Locked On NFL. So thank you everybody for tuning in, whether you're an everydayer. Thank you for tuning in every single day. If you're new to the channel, welcome in. Hopefully you're enjoying the content. Be sure to like and subscribe. And if you're somewhere in the middle, welcome back to the show. Alvin Kamara in New Orleans. There has been some potential drama stirring. Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints will join us to give us all the information we didn't know coming up now. Is there drama in New Orleans with Alvin Kamara? Here to talk about that with me, it's Ross Jackson, the host of Locked On Saints. And Ross, we heard, with mandatory minicamp, guys are supposed to show up, participate. Alvin Kamara was there, but then there's been all this conversation about, he's walking out on the Saints and this whole contract dispute that's going on. I want to hear it from the source, Ross. You are plugged in, as we hear on Locked On Podcast Network are with our teams every single day. What is going on with Alvin Kamara? Because I don't know how serious this is. So I wanted to bring on the expert to talk about it.
Yeah, it's serious in that Alvin Kamara wants a new deal, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I'm very much on the player's side when it comes to this, as I typically am when it comes to matters within the NFL. But in this one, this seems like a no-brainer. Is this a bad situation? No, not yet. Can it become a bad situation? Certainly. Down the road, you know how contract disputes can go. They can get a lot worse. But I think that the way that we've been discussing the way that this has really gone down has been a bit of a disservice to what Alvin Kamara has actually done, which has effectively made some noise, right? It participated in walkthroughs, didn't participate in the rest of minicamp practice that day. But it's not like he stormed out, made a big scene, threw his helmet off, and left the building and went across the street to Smoothie King or something like that. That was not a situation. All that he did was not participate in practice. When we showed up to the facility that day for practice, he was in the parking lot walking back into the facility. We talked to him. We said hi. It wasn't that big of a deal. And I think that this shouldn't be a huge matter by the time that it's all said and done. I have the feeling this will be a forgotten storyline by the time we get to week one.
I think it does bring a couple of interesting conversational points, though, Ross, just in terms of what his future could be in New Orleans. How much time is he going to be there for? And plus what that contract could look like if something does get agreed upon. So if you're the Saints, Ross, what do you do in the situation? And what do you feel like is a fair common ground for Kamara and the Saints?
Yeah, I give him a 2-year extension that includes some guaranteed money in 2025, which at the moment he has $0 worth of guaranteed money. And I believe only has about $1 million of his $10.2 million base salary guaranteed this year as well. So we're talking about a guy who's got an average of half $500,000 guaranteed over the course of the next 2 years. Yeah, I wouldn't want to play on that either, especially as a 28-plus-year-old running back, And so I think you give him, a 2-year extension, and you can make that APY whatever. None of it matters in terms of how much it is per year, but give him $8 million worth of additional guarantees, which is significantly more than what he has right now. And then this conversation probably goes away. Kevin, I have a really, really good feeling here that this conversation for Alvin Kamara and his camp is less about how much money he's making right now and how much money is guaranteed to him and how much the organization is committing to him being a part of their future. As of right now, there's no commitment to a future. $20+ million next year, 0 of it is guaranteed. That's not a real season. That's not a real year on a contract. Right. Some of that has to get redone. Some of that has to get guaranteed. The Saints have already done this with 2 players this offseason, both of which would be considered quote unquote aging players. Tyrann Mathieu, star safety, Demario Davis, star linebacker. They should be able to get this done with that same type of parameter here with Alvin Kamara.
And then I feel like also when you talk about his role and just who Alvin Kamara is as a player at this point in his career, we know the age-old saying of the older running backs get what is their value and what does it look like and what are they worth. Well, we still know Kamara is a really good player, a really good running back, but as his career has evolved and as we kind of enter this 2024 season, Ross, what is his role to you on the Saints and how effective is Alvin Kamara still right now in his career?
Yeah, I think the efficacy and the role of Alvin Kamara in 2024 is going to far, far, far outshadow that which it has been over the course of the past 3 years because he won't be misused. He's been overwhelmingly misused since Sean Payton's last year. And then the last 2 years with offensive coordinator Pete Carmichael, who looked like he had no idea how to utilize a run game, period, because so much of Alvin Kamara's game as you know, with having seen these sort of scat back, these change of pace backs in Baltimore, you don't run these guys between the tackles. You get them out in space,
right,
and you utilize them in those types of situations. For the Saints, for the past 3 years, the majority of Alvin Kamara's runs may have been zone runs by classification, but they've been inside zone runs. He's been running between the tackles way too much. They need to get him back to operating in space. Clint Kubiak, new offensive coordinator, is bringing that wide zone offense with a bit of that Shanahan influence into it here to New Orleans in 2024. They've been telling us but we've been hearing since the combine that Alvin Kamara is going to be a huge part of the 2024 offense for the New Orleans Saints and for Clint Kubiak's wide zone scheme. I think that these two are a match made in heaven, and it would be a failure of the organization if they can't get this done. I think if they can't get an extension done, it doesn't come down to Alvin Kamara. It comes down to the New Orleans Saints.
There's also been plenty made about Taysom Hill's contract ever since that deal was signed. And I know everybody learned what void years were when that deal was signed. But with the restructure, Ross, there was some news about Taysom Hill this past week with a busy New Orleans Saints day for you, I know. Can you kind of dive into that and what it could mean for the Saints over the course of the rest of this offseason and some money they have freed up now?
Yeah, look, they restructured his deal. It opens up $6.6 million. They now have just over $12 million of available salary cap left, and all the salary cap nerds are trying to figure out how the New Orleans Saints now have spending money. But look, here's the thing. To me, this move isn't really about the spending money and them turning around and spending it right away. They absolutely could, right? Safety Justin Simmons is still out there. The Saints could use some help at safety. There's, other places that they can go to potentially bring in some new talent, but is there talent left available on the market that you need $6.5 million to sign? I don't think so. Maybe Justin Simmons being the one exclusion to that conversation. So for me, this contract restructure is about the New Orleans Saints having an eye towards their future. What happens if they get to the trade deadline, which is now later on in the year, they have an injury on the team, or they have a need on their team that feels like they can get them over the hump if they are competitive at that point? This now offers them the opportunity to be able to actually be active at the trade deadline. Furthermore, they could roll money that they don't use in 2024 into the already $85 million over the salary cap. Here we are again, Kevin, in 2025 they could do that as well. And the other piece for me too, is that this is a commitment in a way to Taysom Hill. This kind of tells you that Taysom Hill is going to finish his career here in New Orleans. And people thought that the Saints overpaid for him at $10 million per year. If you look at the last 3 years combined, Taysom Hill is number one on the New Orleans Saints list of combined rushing and receiving touchdowns with 20, above the other guy that we were just talking about, Alvin Kamara. So this is a good sort of commitment to Taysom Hill, and it may be an opportunity for them to have something open and ready to go should they need to pivot at any point later on in the season, or bring in some help to help them get over the hump and finally get back to the playoffs.
Ross providing some clarity there. So shout out to Ross. And for more on Ross, you can check him out over at Locked On Saints and right here on Locked On NFL, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. That's all I have for you here today on Locked On NFL. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to like and subscribe in video form, follow along, subscribe in audio form as well. 5 days a week of NFL content, so you're not missing out any which way. Coming up tomorrow, more NFL content, of course, with your Tuesday host. So be sure to stay tuned. We'll see you right back here tomorrow on Locked On NFL.